Goodness me. Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for raising all the very relevant and challenging points that you have. And I'm sure that everybody in the room and online is very keen to dive into a discussion about all of this, and you probably don't want to listen to me for very long. So the good news is you won't. But what I would like to do is just look at our response to the Syria crisis in two ways. The first one is just a very brief assessment of Oxfam's own experience against the three key criteria that we hold ourselves accountable to, which are timeliness, relevance, and accountability to those affected. And then I would just like to take 30 seconds at the end to reflect on an issue which I know exercises us a great deal, and I'm sure it does others in the room and in the discussion, which is to what extent are our humanitarian principles being compromised? And if so, does that matter? And I think that's the sort of challenge I'd like to leave for the discussion, and I'd love to hear what others think on that point. Timeliness. 18 months ago in Oxfam, we thought that the Syria crisis was not one that was for us. We thought this was a conflict in a middle-income context, that it was likely to be exclusively a protection crisis, and that the role for an organisation like Oxfam, both politically and practically, given the nature of the infrastructure, the nature of livelihoods, the nature of the economy and society, was one where it was highly unlikely that there was a role for Oxfam, and that we equated it very much with our decision-making around the Libya crisis, where we felt that we made the right decision not to be part of the response for that, because we didn't think we would actually have brought any distinctive competence or advantage. And we had it in that box. About 15 months ago, we started to review that, and we started to challenge ourselves on that front. And so to test that, we began work in Jordan around Zatri, and also in Lebanon, where we had a long-term presence working with various gender organisations in Lebanon. And so by this April, we had come full circle in our challenge to ourselves as to whether this was an environment in which an organisation like Oxfam had a distinctive competence, and we felt that not only was it somewhere that we did, but that we must, and we made that a category 1, which in our language is the highest form of organisational priority. But it had taken us way too long to get there. And we have reflected long and hard on that. Some of it was, as I say, I think how we see ourselves and how we see the crisis. Some of it was how the crisis had changed. But even once we had made that decision in November, December last year, that we really did have something to offer, then I think the one thing I would say is that it was very difficult to establish and scale up. And I think, and I know this sounds utterly bizarre because the situation is so different, it's the same conversation that we're having about the Central African Republic now. It is not possible to establish a competent presence on the back of a series of donor grants. The underlying investment that quality response takes is often forgotten, I think, and I think something that we need to take very strongly into our discussions with donors. An issue, a note on timeliness of our work inside Syria. We, like everyone else, were balancing all sorts of different ways. When the opportunity came up in March last year that we could potentially work within our sector of competence, which is water and sanitation, from Damascus. And we spent a lot of time discussing that and, sort of balancing what we thought we could do and decided that we had to try this out. And so it was in mid-June last year when a small delegation of us visited Damascus at the invitation of the Ministry of Water Resources, and I'm happy to talk more about that if people would like. But just to say, that has been a fascinating, challenging, frustrating, rewarding, by turn experience, and I'm sure the Ministry of Water Resources would say exactly the same thing about us. And as a result, from the end of November through working on the design of how we support the re-establishment of large-scale water systems, as a result of the work we're doing, we believe we are reaching approximately 250,000 people on both sides of the conflict, or, well, there is no such thing as both sides, across lines in Damascus and Damascus rural, through the maintenance of water systems. That has challenged us enormously. That it's relevant, I think, is definitely true. That it's accountable in a way we would recognise in other crises, no, it's not. It's all about triangulating information. It's all about working in a situation which is physically very challenging and politically too. And so have we compromised on some of that? Yes, we have. Do we regret it? No, we don't. Not now. You may ask us in another year and we may say, yes, we made a mistake. But at the time, I think it comes down to all humanitarian dilemmas. You make the best judgment you can at the time based on the information you have. And if the option is not to do it, then I don't think that would have been suitable at the moment or appropriate. So I share that very openly. And I would also just add on relevance of work in Jordan and Lebanon. I agree with everything everybody said about people living in camps, people living in communities. It is hugely challenging. And this isn't just to do a plug for a report, although you may think it is. But we have recently worked with the Beirut Research and Innovation Centre and the Centre for Learning and Research in Lebanon to produce a report which I had nothing to do with, so I can say this openly. I think is one of the most fascinating documents I've read in a long time, about a survey on the livelihoods of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, how people are coping and the nature and scale of the challenges that they are facing. And it really does challenge our way of working. And gives us some really interesting insights to how people are living. So again, I won't go into that in a lot of detail, but it is really interesting, and I think it challenges a lot of what we're doing at the moment. And the challenge to us as a community will be whether or not we can take this on and really change the way we work. So that's a few reflections on timeliness, relevance and accountability. I just leave for discussion really some of the huge challenges I think we all face as a community on impartiality, neutrality and independence. Impartiality, there are, at our best estimate at the moment, 9.3 million Syrians in need of humanitarian assistance. 2 million of them are outside Syria, 7.3 are inside. We do not know what people are getting who are inside Syria, but I think those two numbers put side by side with the fact we don't even know means that impartiality has been torn up and thrown out, and we are not talking about it. And I think that is hugely important. Neutrality, I think we have, and I think David's reflections are very relevant on this, I think we are being as neutral as we possibly can, and I think there are people we are working with inside Syria who are going beyond all reasonable lengths to ensure that that is the case. Independence, I would say the same thing, but I think we could have hours, and I would love to have hours of discussions on this. But I think the question I would leave us with is and this is something that we touched on in the DEC Emergencies Directors meeting a few weeks ago. Are we really being transparent and communicating with the people who gave money to the DEC appeal about those points, about how impartial their response is being, about how neutral it is, and how creative we are being? And I think that our view as Oxfam is that we could be much more transparent and communicate a great deal more, and people would value that transparency and being trusted with that. And we would be very much behind increased voice on that. So I leave that on the table for further discussion.
Jane, thank you very much indeed. Just two things strike me. One, to thank you for being so open and giving us an insight into the kind of organisational judgment calls and dilemmas that you have to face. I think that's really important for all of us to understand. And secondly, for bringing up this issue, which I think is obviously is at the heart of who we are, around the principles of impartiality and neutrality. And this emergency clearly brings this up in a way that is potentially has profound implications. So we have an awful lot on the table there. We have about half an hour, and so anyone with any questions, clarifications, views, I can see there are a few people. Please, when you speak, please can you say who you are and which organisation, if any, you are affiliated to.